All right. Hello. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Co-opting AI. I'm Mona Sloane. I am an assistant professor of data science and media studies here at the University of Virginia. I study how AI systems get embedded into social life. I also host the series, the Co-opting AI series. And today we will um, focus on a massive elephant in the room, geopolitics. Our conversation today will tend to an aspect that AI has always been a part of, but that has really become blatantly apparent, especially more recently in global conflicts that have erupted and the role that AI systems play in that. So welcome to our conversation on AI and geopolitical concerns. Now, AI, of course, is a technology story, but when we consider the geopolitical aspects of AI, we are very much reminded that AI is also a power story and thus a political one. Now, much like earlier transformative technologies, think printing, think the steam engine, think the atomic bomb or the internet, AI is not staying inside national borders in many ways. AI's geopolitical implications are heightened because it is simultaneously an infrastructure, a potential economic engine, an epistemic environment, and also a weapon. Much in the same way in which AI mediates social relations in our most immediate environments, it also affects how nation states perceive geopolitical environments, the threats and the opportunities, as well as what they can do and how they perceive the future. And all of that has direct implications for us, for the citizens. The global political economy is vast, ranging from rare earths that are required for chips productions, data workers that operate in the majority world, and much more. Let's also think about data centers that produce environmental concerns, but also local economic opportunity. Just this week, the US state of Maine has passed its first moratorium on data center construction, for example. Now, assumptions about world orders are both sort of reaffirmed and shaken up in and through AI. Colonial and post-war power hierarchies resurface, but also recede, and all technologies conjure up deep moral questions about how we should live and what the future should look like, and AI is no exception. Who gets to set the norms in the geopolitical context of AI? What counts as a safe AI system? What means safe and for whom? Finding answers to these questions has always been difficult on global multicultural stages, especially on those that are fragmented and tension-filled, like perhaps the one we find ourselves in today. Unsurprisingly, fairly fragile attempts to build international AI governance, think the EU AI Act or the Seoul and Paris AI Safety Summits, run headlong into a geopolitical environment that makes multilateral consensus a little bit harder at the moment. And then, of course, there is national security, perhaps the domain where the stakes are most visceral. Autonomous weapon systems, AI-accelerated cyber operations, AI-assisted intelligence analysis, the AI use for surveillance and social control. These are no longer hypotheticals. Those things are part of our world with AI. AI changes the logic of deterrence, of escalation, and conflict in ways that we are only now beginning to recognize and understand. Now, needless to say that we have plenty to talk about today, and I am absolutely delighted and grateful to welcome three extremely smart people who will help us unpack this rapidly evolving field of AI's geopolitics. Please join me in welcoming Pablo Chavez, Chinasa Okolo, and Nick Cernick. Now, starting us off today will be Pablo Chavez, who is a technology policy expert and advisor who specializes in critical digital technologies, including AI and cloud computing. He writes for Lawfare and CEPA. He has been quoted in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and Politico, and many others. He also teaches as a Senior Adjunct Fellow at CNAS and is a non-resident Senior Fellow at Georgetown's CSET, and he serves on the board of the Open Technology Fund. Before all that, he led global public policy at Google Cloud, US public policy at Microsoft, and global public policy at LinkedIn. And he served as a senior staffer in the US Senate. He has a JD from Stanford Law and an AB in Public and International Affairs from Princeton. Welcome, Pablo. Following Pablo today will be Nick Cernick. He's a senior lecturer in digital economy at King's College London. He has written wonderful books, including Silicon Empires, which came out last year with Polity Press. He has also written After Work, A History of the Home and the Fight for Free Time with Verso. Came out in 2023, and that was written with Helen Hester. And he has also written Platform Capitalism 2016 with Polity, and Inventing the Future Post-Capitalism and a World Without Work with Verso 2015 with Alex Williams. Many books, incredible. Nick, you have to tell me how you do this. Closing us out today will be Chinasa Teokolo, who is the founder of Technicultura, which and she is a policy specialist at the United Nations Office for Digital and Emerging Technologies and a recent computer science PhD graduate from Cornell. Her work focuses on governance and safety for the global majority, on datafication and algorithmic marginalization, and the geopolitical impacts of AI. She has been recognized as one of the world's most influential people in AI by Time. And she has also been honored in the inaugural Forbes 30 Under 30 AI list. She advises numerous multilateral institutions, national governments, corporations, and nonprofits. She's a former fellow at Brookings, and she has worked in research-based roles at Apple and Microsoft, and her work has been covered widely in various media outlets, and she has published in top-tier venues in human-computer interaction and socio-technical computing. Now, you can see why I'm very excited about our conversation today. And with that, I'm going to be quiet and hand it over to Pablo. Please listen to what our wonderful panelists have to say today. As per usual, start folding your questions into the conversation through the Q&A box at the bottom right of your screen. Welcome, Pablo. Welcome, Nick. Welcome to NASA. Thank you for joining us. And Pablo, over to you.
Awesome. Thanks so much. Can I also plug my Substack? It's Consensus Drift. Please sign up. There's kind of interesting stuff on there. So thanks again, Mona, for the opportunity to be here. And it's really great to be here with you, with Chinasa, and with Nick, who are really kind of tremendous thinkers in the space. So really looking forward to hearing what they're contributing to the conversation. But I guess I'm the kind of lead-off hitter. So let's get this started. So what I'd like to do in the next few minutes is kind of primarily challenge what I think is one of the dominant frames for AI and geopolitics, and that is that this idea that AI competition on the global stage is kind of a two-player race between the U.S. and China exclusively. And what I'd like to do is kind of suggest that maybe we should replace that frame with something closer to what I think is actually happening on the ground in dozens of countries right now. And I'll say just to be clear that the kind of dyadic kind of two-player frame holds in some ways, right? In terms of kind of like perhaps AI chip competition, perhaps with frontier models. But I do think that it misses what so many countries are doing and how they're asserting themselves across the AI stack, and have been doing over the last several years. I think that what is emerging is messier, and more interesting than just a two-player game. And more specifically, I think what we're seeing is more than 50 countries around the world that are pursuing what a lot of kind of observers and participants call sovereign AI or AI sovereignty. And what they're doing is they're doing this by kind of actively building their own AI capabilities, even though, candidly, as they remain integrated in kind of a global tech and AI ecosystem that is, often shaped by Washington and by Beijing and other large players. So I'll talk about that, and also I'd love to touch on the U.S. role in this ecosystem, primarily to underscore that really kind of understanding and being responsive to this emerging landscape is critical for any serious and responsible American AI statecraft effort over the next several years. So let me start by trying to offer a working definition of what sovereign AI is. But I need to point out that there really is no standard definition. This is kind of like my attempted effort at this. Um, Sovereign AI, as I see it, is basically kind of a political and technical strategy through which governments are kind of seeking to shape the development, the deployment, the control of AI, and specifically models, compute, and data, in pursuit of their national interests, right? And in pursuit of their national objectives, however it is that those are defined. And and I guess moving beyond the definition, I would say that it's a spectrum of activities. It's not kind of like one uniform approach to kind of sovereign AI, across all these countries. And when you think about it as a spectrum, perhaps the way to kind of like look at it is to say that, on one end of the spectrum are countries that are asserting control over how a foreign AI is deployed within their borders. And a lot of that is basically kind of like a regulatory effort, sometimes procurement efforts as well, or government procurement efforts. At the other end, kind of farther on the other side of the spectrum, countries are building models, they're building data infrastructure, they're assembling AI compute clusters, and it's less about regulation and more about building capacity, right? It's governments and countries essentially becoming producers of AI and market participants in the AI in the kind of the global AI ecosystem, rather than simply just regulators. And so that's kind of what they're doing. I think there's a question about what motivates all of this, right? And I guess what I would say is that across the different countries that I've been looking at, kind of see the same kind of prompts and catalysts and anxieties popping up, right? I'd say that the first, generally speaking, is kind of this notion of strategic autonomy, this idea that countries should have the ability to allocate, for example, compute and govern AI use on national terms, kind of independent of kind of foreign governments and private sector players. The second I would say is data protection, not in a privacy sense, but rather in the sense of each country has kind of a strategic set of essentially databases that relate to government records, language, history, health data, and all of this is kind of raw material from which AI capability is built, right? And so the idea of placing that on foreign infrastructure, putting that in the hands of foreign players, perhaps means surrendering some amount of leverage and kind of like ability to kind of define your own future. A third, I would say, is kind of this emerging idea of kind of this kind of like it's the kill switch problem, basically. And so this is kind of like the fear that and concern that a foreign government could terminate access to AI systems that your country depends on. For leverage in a crisis, or really just because the relationship changes between your two countries. And I'd say that here the concern is that the core infrastructure of your economy, right, of your country, that really over the next few years is going to start supporting healthcare, energy, government services, and other domains. So that AI infrastructure could be turned off, perhaps, by another country. And that is, that's a driver for some of this. I'd say that other things are, economic competition, national security, of course, cultural preservation. All of these kind of round out a picture that is, when you think about it, it's as much about identity and agency as it is just about kind of a strict, technology issue, right? So, so that's kind of like the overview. In terms of kind of like the specific projects that I've been looking at, I guess I'd say that, broadly speaking, the scope and scale of this effort is kind of something that I've been tracking over the last few years. And just to give you some numbers, in 2024, I found that kind of roughly kind of at the time, 40 government-backed sovereign AI initiatives around, across about 30 countries. By January of this year, the number of countries had grown by about two-thirds, and the number of projects had nearly tripled. So it's approaching 130 projects across more than 50 countries. I'll note that that data is going to be published in the next couple of weeks by the Center for New American Security, which, as you said, I'm affiliated with them as a non-resident senior fellow. And so we're going to be doing that later this month as a sovereign AI index. So keep your eye out for that. So that's kind of like an opening picture. And I'll say that, as I suggested before, how countries are doing this really matters. Sovereign AI isn't really about going it alone. In reality, kind of no country is really fully sovereign. I think there's a little bit of debate about this right now, but at least that's my point of view. Every sovereign AI effort in the data that I've looked at is hybrid, right? There's domestic oversight and targeted capability building that's combined with continued reliance on foreign chips, sometimes models, sometimes cloud partners, and so forth. Um, in terms of kind of specific examples, India kind of comes to mind, right? And that if, I think most of us, many of us have been thinking about it because earlier this year, New Delhi was the host of the India AI Impact Summit, which, among other things, kind of brought together governments and industry from across the global south, which is kind of a very important set of participants and audience as well. And I'll say that India's strategy has three parts. So it's shared compute, national data sets, and domestic models. And those three, in some combination of those three, that's basically kind of like the range of sovereign AI projects that I've looked at. On compute, the Indian government has basically brought together something like 38,000 GPUs that are being made available to Indian startups at subsidized rates. On data, the government has a thing called AI Kosh, which is this kind of national platform of something like 5,500 data sets, again, to train models. And then specifically on foundation models, the government is funding about 12 model families that are partly or largely trained on Indian data and that are meant to kind of support the Indian public sector and Indian industry, once they get launched. But again, this is hybrid sovereignty, right? At the foundation, these are still efforts that work with, American AI chips, for example, sometimes base models that are not domestic. But what I would say is, that doesn't mean that the sovereignty isn't real. It's real, but so is the partnership, and so is the interdependency. So it's this kind of hybrid notion. I'll close out with a couple of things. So first. I mentioned India, but that's really kind of on the ambitious side of the sovereign AI spectrum. And honestly, most countries, as you can guess, and as you know, don't have the scale, the capital, the talent, to build out, kind of like that kind of a robust sovereign AI program. So for them, the sovereign AI path is really kind of it runs through open weight models, right? So not building from scratch, but instead adapting models that are built elsewhere. So based on Meta's Llama, based on Mistral's open models, based on Alibaba's Qwen family. And I would say that kind of like as I've looked at this, what's kind of striking about this effort is that these countries, I'll say like roughly three-quarters of national model projects that I've been looking at, they're pursuing open weight approaches, right? So Denmark, Chile, Greece, other countries, for all of them, sovereignty is not about kind of like closing off. It's not locking the door. It's just about being at the table and releasing their own open weights models. So this is not a traditional. In some cases, it's not this traditional notion of I think what we would think of as sovereignty. Instead, they're kind of sharing what they build, which is to me is kind of fascinating. Uh, I'll say one more thing about that, which is that this whole approach is honestly like under pressure right now because, for example, like Alibaba is shifting toward closed models. Meta recently has been signaling something similar, and so the open weight movement that gave kind of dozens of these countries a path to building capable national AI may turn out to be kind of just a moment, right? And not a trend, not a trajectory. And I'll say that if frontier open weight models stop advancing, countries that are fine-tuning on them won't just fall behind, right? Like they'll just stagnate in the in the AI ecosystem. Last thing, so turning again back to as I mentioned before, I'd like to talk a little bit about U.S. AI statecraft. So these problems land directly in the middle of that statecraft, and the current administration's response points to what I think is a central tension, right? So the Trump administration has definitely embraced sovereign AI as part of its international posture. So it's been very clear about this. And the pitch is basically partner with us, use American technology, and we, the United States, will help you build sovereign AI capabilities on our stack, right? But there's a tension there. And I'll say before I talk about kind of like the tension with the US, look, honestly, not every country is building sovereign AI to hedge against DC, right? Some are doing it really in explicit partnership with the US. Others are more worried about China. Others are just simply worried about kind of protecting their language and culture, and like it's not kind of like a, kind of a relationship with another country. But for a good share of countries in the data, the core concern is trust and the fear that the US will change the rules, restrict access, or really use technology dependence as leverage. And I guess I'll say that the language of adopting the language of sovereignty doesn't really answer that fear. The substance really kind of has to follow, and that's what I would call is kind of a sovereignty gap, right? The distance between what the U.S. is offering and its rhetoric on sovereignty and the reality of what many countries are seeking and what they may actually need. And so I think that closing it requires more than giving countries control over how they deploy American AI. It means having clearer terms on non-disruption, clearer terms on exit and portability, commitments that address jurisdictional exposure and other kinds of exposure. And I would say that these steps wouldn't eliminate U.S. leverage. What they would do is make the partnerships credible enough that countries really choose to build with the U.S. rather than trying to build around the American AI stack. So I started by challenging a framing, and hopefully that made sense a little bit. It at least was a little bit thought-provoking about this two-player race. And what I've tried to show is that the strict two-player race isn't really the world I think that's emerging. What we have instead is dozens of countries building hybrid sovereignty, which is real capacity built with global technology ecosystems that keep these countries, fairly integrated into that ecosystem. And that doesn't mean that the U.S. isn't a central player or that China isn't a central player. In the US case, its technology really is woven into most of what is being built outside of the US. But in a multiplayer world, centrality, it's not the same as leadership, right? And the US has extraordinary leverage, but again, leverage and leadership are not the same thing. Leverage is kind of what you have, leadership is what you do with it, right? Um, and so I would suggest in closing that the alternative to using the US position as a choke point is something that I've called digital solidarity in some of my writing, which is the idea that technological self-determination doesn't have to be about kind of going it alone. Countries can achieve real agency through partnerships grounded in open democratic values rather than one-way dependencies. And I think that that's the opportunity to make the US the kind of partner that countries choose to build with, again, rather than the dependency that they're trying to hedge against and build around. So with that, Mona, I'll turn it back to you. And again, thanks so much for the opportunity to participate today.
Thank you so much, Pablo, for that. This was extremely thought-provoking. I have many questions, but I'm holding them because we are going to hear from Nick.
Yeah, thank you. My talk's going to build quite a bit on Pablo's work, actually. So it's, I think, a nice, follows it very nicely here. I've got some slides that I'm going to share. Okay. So I'm going to talk about some sort of speculative research that I've been working on, building off of my book on Silicon Empires and trying to think about where things are going, particularly in 2026, but into the future as well. It's somewhat, like I say, speculative. So if anybody has any issues with it, call me out. I'd like to hear critiques before I publish anything on it. Um, but yeah, I'm going to be talking about AI agents. So agents have become really the hot topic, I think, of 2026 in terms of AI, particularly with Claude Code and Codex and all of these things. The last few months have been a real flurry of activity and interest in this material. And I'm quite curious about what their impact is on geoeconomics. And so that's what I'm going to try and talk about today. So the basic sort of question I want to ask is, how do AI agents transform geoeconomic tools, strategies, and really importantly, vulnerabilities as well? So what are agents? Because I think all of us are familiar with chatbots, but we may or may not be familiar with agents. The basic sort of idea is that they are given a goal by a user, and then they autonomously work towards that over a series of steps. Now, there's varying levels of autonomy, and there's a couple of research papers on, sort of setting out these different levels of autonomy in terms of choosing tools, making decisions, judging different paths of action, and things like that. These things sense and interact with their environment in some way, and then they take actions on behalf of users rather than just returning an answer. Now, what I'm particularly interested in is what's been called the agentic economy. And this is sort of an emerging field of research. I've got some sources there at the bottom if people are interested. It's, I think, a very likely future. And so I'm very keen to sort of think about what its implications are for geopolitics and geoeconomics. And we can see the beginnings of this as agents start to take over a growing number of business processes. We can also see this sort of emerging in terms of, services and the infrastructure of the internet being rebuilt for agents rather than for humans. So instead of having, fancy designed websites, you've just got APIs and you've got MCPs and things like that that allow these agents to much more effectively interact with all of this digital infrastructure. And then eventually you get the sort of full proper agentic economy where agents are starting to interact with other agents in very, significant ways. Now, I think this leads to at least four real significant changes within geoeconomics. The first of this is the shifting geopolitics of compute. And I think a lot of the sort of geopolitical and geoeconomic focus around hardware has been focused on this sort of paradigm of pre-training AI models. And for pre-training an AI model, you need massive compute clusters, multi-gigawatt scale sort of compute clusters, all the sort of concentrated resources that are necessary to make those things possible in terms of energy, steel, chips, whatever. There's very much a flops focus there. So the sort of hardware which is being designed for training is focused on how many flops can you get at, particular levels of, FP8 or whatever. And then export controls have also often been pitched around training capacity. So, what sort of chips can be sold to China, for instance? It depends on how powerful they are in terms of things like flops. And then also the impact on AI sovereignty is that a lot of countries around the world, when they think about AI sovereignty, they think in terms of this training paradigm, that what AI sovereignty means at its sort of, the sort of paradigm goal would be to build these massive compute clusters for yourself. And you can see that, I think, in the UK, but also, UAE and Saudi Arabia are really good examples of that as well. What we see with agents, though, is that it's much more of a move towards inference. So they're not just being trained, they're then running for a very long period of time. And in fact, a lot of the post-training that's necessary for these things relies upon inference as well. So the reinforcement learning, which is necessary to create a coding agent and things like that, requires a lot of inference compute. Now, inference doesn't have to be massively centralized in terms of a compute cluster. It can be much more distributed. And, we see sort of elements of this even being pushed to the edge in terms of AI phones and things like that. There's much more of a focus on memory in terms of inference compute. So in order to do these long-scale tasks, you need to be building up this context, building up this memory. And this is why, we have a massive shortage of memory chips at the moment. This is mostly unaddressed by export controls as they stand. I think that's probably going to change fairly quickly, though. You can look at the NVIDIA H20 controversy last year, where Trump said, okay, we're going to sell the H20s to China. And across Silicon Valley, there was quite an uproar because people in Silicon Valley recognized that the H20s were really good at inference. They may not be all that good in training, but they were quite good at inference. And then how this impacts AI sovereignty is that there's much more focus, I think, on application and sort of building these more decentralized compute clusters rather than having to think about, how do we get gigawatt scale compute. Another key change with agents is that they amplify what's called weaponized interdependence. This has become, I think, a fairly familiar term in recent years. It comes from Henry Farrell and Abraham Newman, and they talk about the use of global networks, sort of weaponizing these by controlling hubs and then exerting power through these global networks. And the two effects that they point to are panopticon effects and choke point effects. And if we look at AI agents, these have massive impacts on both of these sorts of effects. So the panopticon effect is all about, if you've read your Foucault, you know very well, it's all about surveillance. With agents, there's a massive risk of surveillance here because agents, in order to do what they do, they need access to our private digital lives. They benefit from more access to our devices, up to including root access to our devices. And they need to be able to read messages even through encrypted servers. So they need to be able to read unencrypted messages on our devices in a way that just bypasses any sort of encryption that might be built up. And if we think about a sort of future where AI agents are increasingly everywhere, they'll have potential access to diplomats, politicians, military leaders, business leaders, and so on. So the sort of panopticon effects of controlling those agents are quite immense. The choke point effects, and Pablo sort of gestured towards this as well, has to do with cutting off access. So access to an agent can be revoked without notice. We've seen instances of this already. Anthropic has revoked OpenAI's access to Claude Code. They revoked xAI's access as well. I think xAI employees just sort of woke up one morning and found that they couldn't access Claude Code anymore. So there is a sort of way in which these things can be just cut off, with the switch of a button. And so if your economy, say a European economy, is reliant on foreign agents, there is a real risk that that access might be cut off at any point in time. Now, the third major shift that I am sort of thinking about has to do with international inequalities. And here I'm building on work from Sharp et al. And they've sort of focused on these three different inequalities: access, quality, and scale. But I've also added in a fourth one here, which I think is really important for AI agents. So there's an access divide which can emerge between countries, those who have agents and those who don't. There's a quality divide between those who have good agents and those who have bad agents. And I think we're already starting to see this emerge in the sort of different pricing tiers that are becoming really popular for, using a $200 a month Claude Code account or something like that. There's also going to be a scale divide between those who have access to many agents, millions, billions, even trillions of agents, and those who only can access a few agents. And then I think really interestingly, there's also a divide between those who can trust their agents and those who can't. So my sense here is that if you trust your agents, say you're an American company running on American AI agents, you can trust them to not just suddenly be cut off and then to not necessarily spy on you or anything. And so you give them all that access which they benefit from. And you don't have to worry about the sort of panopticon effect. However, if you're a European company building on an American AI agent, you don't necessarily trust that agent in the same way, which means that you don't give it all that access. And so you lose those benefits. And you make it so that you're having to constantly check and be asked, is it okay if I do this? Is it okay if I do this? So all the sort of real potential benefits of AI agents, you have to have trust in them to really get that. And if they're domestic AI agents, you can trust them. If they're foreign, there's going to be a lot more suspicion about them. And then probably my most speculative thought, and I don't really have a lot of, I have an inclination that this is important, but I'm not entirely sure how yet. But it's basically the fact that when people have talked about agentic economies in the literature, it's always closed in individual economies. So this idea that there is one single international, global agentic economy. But of course, that's not what actually globalization is like. The world is built up of different economies with different regulations, different institutions, different authorities, all sorts of different elements involved. So it seems more likely that we'll have, an American agentic economy, a European agentic economy, and, others. And what happens when these things interact? And I haven't found any research on this. If anybody has come across them, I'd love to hear about it, but I haven't heard anybody talk about this yet and the sort of implications of it. So, if you have AI agents that are operating according to different rules, how do they interoperate? What happens when they do that? How do you prevent one system from simply overwhelming or undermining another? And then does that sort of the international inequalities of agents, does that translate into agentic dominance, where you've basically got just those who have access to all these agents overwhelming other agentic economies? All of this, I think, is very speculative, but I think it could become quite important. So sort of to wrap things up here, I think AI agents are going to really amplify these key concerns of AI sovereignty. And I sort of break it down into three different areas that I think AI sovereignty is focused on, which is worries about dependency on a foreign provider, worries about being able to control and regulate and shape the way in which that technology is being used and deployed, and then worries about economic value and being able to capture some of the value from these AI systems. So I think, if you look to Europe right now, there's a lot of worry about running European businesses on American clouds. I think in the future, it's going to be a worry about running European businesses on American AI agents. So I think that's going to become an increasingly important theme. And then very speculatively, where does this, I think, leave us? I think on one level, it's actually a sort of a positive story. I think we can rethink AI sovereignty now that we've moved away from that sort of pre-training paradigm towards a more inference-based paradigm. It gives more opportunities to a lot of countries around the world. So these agent systems often rely on smaller models, teams of smaller models to do these things. And you might have the big, large models sort of orchestrating and coordinating all these teams. But there is a lot of room for these small model systems to really do a lot. There's also a lot of progress which has been made in the sort of the scaffolding or the harnesses or the frameworks built around these models. And this is a relatively cheap thing to produce. A lot of it is open source. OpenClaw was created by one person. It doesn't require spending tens of billions or hundreds of billions of pounds or dollars to do this sort of stuff. So I think in terms of AI sovereignty for, say, Europe and many other countries around the world, I think three really important imperatives are to keep the agentic scaffolding open, so make it open source, make it interoperable, to keep data portable so it doesn't get trapped within a particular closed-in ecosystem, and then also supply any necessary interoperable infrastructure that, I think the incentive for private companies is to provide this infrastructure, but to do so in ways which are very proprietary, very closed in, and channeling users into their ecosystems. I think governments can provide a sort of interoperable infrastructure as an alternative. And then also thinking about, the sorts of regulations that might be necessary for cross-border agentic economies and what that might mean in the future. All of this, I think, is actually quite achievable. Like none of this costs a lot of money. It takes effort, it takes some skill and some talent, but it's not chasing the frontier game. It's operating AI sovereignty in, I think, a quite different way. If you're interested, here's references. I can send slides around to anybody you might want. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Nick. Perfectly building on the idea of AI sovereignty, and I cannot wait to hear what Chinasa has to say as well.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, so thank you to Mona and the rest of the team for the invitation. No slides on my end, but I'll talk about a couple pieces of my work that really integrate into this idea of how strategic geopolitical competition is impacting Africa and also other global majority regions more broadly. And also to clarify, global majority is also, let's say, used as another term for global south or low and middle income countries. And so you don't definitely want to, I would say, consolidate or homogenize a lot of these experiences, but we do see very interesting similarities across countries in these regions. And so I've written about a lot about this more recently for the Social Science Research Council, and then also where else? Lawfare, actually. I'm just understanding that there is very interesting nuances when it comes to geopolitical competition. And obviously, we see this interesting race or, a race for influence when it comes to critical minerals and other natural resources across African countries and, across a lot those in Latin America, South and Southeast Asia. And then also there's competition for influence in these AI ecosystems. I mentioned in a lot of my work that we see international development agencies, USAID, before it was dismantled, was starting to get a lot into this, influencing, helping develop and support national and continental AI strategies. I was involved in the process for Nigeria's national AI strategy, and that was actually sponsored by a lot of different organizations, UNESCO, UNDP, and even tech companies like Meta, Microsoft, and Google. And across Africa, we see GIZ, which is Germany's state development agency, funding a lot of these efforts. And the EU itself has this initiative called D4D, which is focused on data for development and is centering on providing support and funding for data governance and data protection strategies and laws across Africa. And so we see this also play into this, series of these global dialogues, particularly, on these AI safety or AI summits. And I've been fortunate to attend a couple of them. I was in New Delhi a couple of months ago for the India AI Impact Summit as well. And this we've seen, this idea of international cooperation play into these summits, but also into some of the outcomes or outputs, particularly these international declarations and also agreements and initiatives as well. In my work, I just want to note that I'm speaking personally, not as someone who's affiliated with the UN, but we have seen countries like China, specifically lead these AI-focused resolutions to ensure that global South countries have a role in terms of shaping these global AI governance initiatives and also narratives as well. And so I'll start off, framing in a lot of my conversations on this topic. I talk about the AI divide, and I show a lot of maps, particularly when it comes to concentration of AI talent, production of AI models, even locations of data centers and or AI-specific computing centers. And Africa always, tends to stick out on this respective maps. There's an estimated about anywhere from 5,000 to 62,000 AI professionals on the continent. This is a wide gap or wide range actually, but there isn't, I would say, specific numbers. And many of these, researchers or engineers actually work for US companies that are based in the continent. So like Google, IBM, Microsoft, and others as well. However, I do want to note that there is a burgeoning local startup scene, and there are companies building a lot of these technologies, and I track this in my personal work as well. And then when it comes to AI startup investment, we see that African companies or AI startups have only received 0.03% of global venture capital investment in AI. And this is a very paltry amount, for about 14 so million compared to the 47.8 billion raised in aggregate. And this refers to just the third quarter of 2025. And I assume that will look very similar for the last quarter of 2025 and this quarter, which is coming to an end very soon. When it comes to GPU access, only about 1% of African AI researchers can actually access the compute resources they need. And honestly, when it comes to AI-specific compute on the continent, it's very rare. A lot of the compute is more useful for, I'd say, like inference of AI models and let's say, and just very light use of these respective tools as well. And we see that when it comes to data center concentration, primarily in South Africa and also Nigeria and other countries along the northern, west, and eastern coast of the continent. And so going back into this idea of this geopolitical competition within Africa specifically, we see that for digital infrastructure, I've talked about China and their influence, in their respective Belt and Road Initiative and also their Digital Silk Road Initiative. And this has definitely helped many African countries improve access to data centers, cloud services, 5G networks, and even fiber optic cables, which are obviously essential for access to digital technologies and services. We've seen companies like Huawei pledge over $400 million for African data centers and 5G labs, and also, seeing these companies start to interact or operate, excuse me, directly within African countries. Again, we've seen obviously this investment translate to other forms of infrastructure, including airports, train or railroad, excuse me, and other areas and buildings more broadly and highways as well. So also, thinking about how Western actors or, higher income countries think about the idea of capacity building, which is something I've also explored in my work, where it comes to supporting local research, developing these ethical standards, and also forming partnerships with African institutions. There's a consortium of funders focused on supporting AI research within Africa. This is mainly composed of GIZ, Germany's State Development Agency, IDRC, Canada's Development Agency, FCDO, the UK's Development Agency, and also big philanthropy like the Gates Foundation, for example. And so they're funding research centers. There's a hub at the University of Cape Town that they're funding, and also funding a new data and computing cluster in Nigeria as well. And so we're starting to see a lot of work poured into investment and fundamental research in the African context. And again, before USAID was dismantled, there was a lot of efforts from the US side to get into that as well. And so we do see that the US, obviously, China, and some of the development agencies or countries like Germany, Canada, the UK are not the only players in this space. In Russia, particularly, through the BRICS coalition, it's also starting to think about, these global South, global majority alliances when it comes to AI. And there was a BRICS AI declaration that was pronounced last year among the leaders of this respective grouping to ensure that there is leadership, from these respective countries in the global AI landscape. And then also considering that we see other. All right, I'm back. All right, and so I was mentioning, there are countries, like the UAE, for example, investing a lot, particularly, on the infrastructure side. Within African countries, haven't seen a lot of, efforts focused on AI specifically, but the UAE is generally positioning themselves as a global hub for compute power, which is very interesting given that, the environment of the country is not necessarily the best suited for data centers and cloud computing centers more broadly. We've seen the UAE supporting, and when it comes to the UAE and Russia specifically, I do have concerns regarding, let's say, the authoritarian nature of these respective countries, and not to, I would say, excuse, let's say more democratic leaning countries like the US, which have definitely, which has definitely had a lot of issues more recently, or just generally itself. But we've seen the support from the UAE and Russia in supporting these autocratic leaders and paramilitary forces. And so as their influence also translates over to AI, this ideal, of embedding anti-democratic values or purposes into AI models could be something that, increases across different African countries. We see these countries across the continent also spending about $1 billion a year on surveillance technologies and, imprisoning civilians and journalists for expressing, views against respective governments. And so going back into this, ideal or focus on multilateral AI agreements and international cooperation, lots of African countries have signed on to the Bletchley Declaration, the other statements produced from the Paris AI Action Summit, and also even, developing declarations of their own. We've seen the Africa Declaration on AI come out last year from the a global summit on AI in Africa that happened in Kigali. And so, however, while these non-binding pledges, get a lot of publicity, particularly in terms of the amounts of money that are committed, to supporting inclusive and responsible AI growth. We haven't seen a lot of follow-up in terms of understanding where this money is actually going, how it's being deployed, and what actually are the tangible benefits of AI. And so I think that African governments, have to understand how to best position themselves in terms of seeking partnerships with different, or external partners, and then understanding how best to develop AI in their respective interests. And I think a lot of times understanding where other investments in non-digital or non-AI technologies may actually, as produce more beneficial outcomes as well. This is something I, talk about a lot in my work because I think that the current framing or focus on, large, expansive AI models and systems actually doesn't fit what many African consumers or even those in other low resource environments require for their engagement with digital technologies as well. And so I think there's a lot of interest right now in supporting responsible AI or AI diffusion across different contexts, but it comes with, potentially a lot of trade-offs that African governments and those across other low resource regions have to really be considerate or consider of. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Janasa. And I now have the privilege of asking you a few questions. And in the meantime, dear audience members, please put your questions into the Q&A box. I will fold them into the discussion. So, Chaz, I'm just going to stay with you for a moment. When we talk about AI, I think it is fair to say that, it is a cultural phenomenon and that AI concerns are local concerns as much as they are national or international concerns. And so I'm curious to hear from your perspective and, from the work that you do, what are some of the specific AI concerns that you hear from African countries? You spoke about your work in Nigeria. Are those plainly about competition and capacity building, or are there, more nuances there? Because of course, some of the African countries, as you said, are providing or a home to minerals and rare earths. And we also see sort of a global political economy of the sort of shadow workforce of AI that maps onto sort of a colonial map. So can you maybe just briefly talk about what are some very specific African AI concerns outside of the sort of usual list?
Definitely. I would say generally, being sort of, let's say, a dumping or testing ground for these unproven and non-contextually relevant solutions. We're seeing a lot of companies, particularly OpenAI, start to expand their language capacities and also even build or install personnel in African countries or focus on Africa more broadly. There was a recent launch at the University of Lagos in Nigeria for OpenAI's first AI hub on the continent. And I think that, African consumers are realizing that, okay, even though you say your model works in Swahili, like it doesn't necessarily fit the kind of Swahili I speak in my daily life. And you're also like producing false information when I'm just trying to search for basic, information. Obviously, this could be done on a search engine, obviously. But I think that that's a very big concern. And then also the labor impacts, which you got into are very prominent, particularly within Eastern Africa, Kenya, for example, focusing on pushing regulation to help support data workers, content laborers, or moderation as well. And so this is something because right now for many African, say jobs or workers, excuse me, like the easiest way to get involved in AI is for them to be a data labeler because of the skills gap when it comes to, having, let's say, a master's level or PhD level education to, focus on developing these AI models and conducting this fundamental research. And so those are some of the concerns I think that African countries are thinking about. Obviously, understanding natural resources and geopolitical competition more broadly.
Yeah, thanks for that. And that really kind of speaks to AI as sort of an epistemic infrastructure, right? And then sort of an epistemic infrastructure for knowledge building that also is critical for navigating everyday life, perhaps even in, the agentic future that Nick spoke about. And I have some very pressing questions around that, Nick. But before that, Pablo, if we sort of built on that, right? And we on the idea of AI as infrastructure, basic epistemic infrastructure, um, you spoke about how centrality is not the same as leadership. And I think that you spoke a lot about how governments now become actors, market actors in this sort of, national, but also global marketplace of AI. But what we're also seeing is, that companies are, especially American companies, are very much competing with each other, right? If you read, for example, Karen Howe's Empire of AI and her sort of telling of how OpenAI came about as a fair amount about imaginations of competition, tech competition within the US, right? And we have a lot of power in this privately held infrastructure. How do you sort of square that, the sort of your, your call for acknowledging that centrality is not the same as leadership, digital solidarity, if you will, being at the table as being more important than building the table and controlling who has a seat at it? What's the role of private versus public here?
So, I mean, there's so many different ways to cut this, right? So, is the unit of competition the nation state or is it a corporation, right? And so forth. I mean, if you, I think that the primary driver for me to kind of like talk about solidarity and ensuring that there remains a connection among countries isn't necessarily about kind of like talking about the country as the most important unit or the unit of focus. It's more just because we are in this kind of like geopolitical moment, right? Where essentially these kind of like relationships, whether it's trade, diplomacy, and so forth between countries is kind of being torn apart a little bit, and so um, normatively, like what I'm trying to get at is like, hey, we need to kind of like perhaps kind of hold on to that world a little bit because it's a better a world of bridges is better than a world of walls, generally speaking. With respect to kind of like the corporations, I think that the issue here is that like most of the technology and the know-how, right, sits in in the hyperscalers or in the AI labs and so forth. And so there is there the capacity and the capability is there, but the geopolitical, the politics are not there, right? So you need kind of like need to kind of like, steer and, and push these companies, in that direction. And I think that that becomes really, really complicated, right? Because there is both the conversation, the state to state conversation, but then there's also this question about like, are companies, internet American companies in Europe or Africa or wherever, are they doing good or are they doing bad? And I acknowledge that complicates the picture a little bit, but I think that like that again, in this broader frame, the way to kind of like look at it is, at least for now, kind of state to state and trying to kind of like, steer those gov to gov relationships and then ultimately kind of get the companies also on board. I'll say one last thing, which is that I think that there is, in the sovereignty context, I think that there's a lot of criticism of some criticism of American companies as sovereignty washing, right? This idea that like, oh, well, if we're building on an American hyperscaler, that's not really kind of sovereignty. I personally think that like the picture is a little bit more nuanced than that. I think that like all actors in this space should be a little bit more open to this, kind of working together versus kind of like accusations one way or another about, kind of like what is truly sovereignty or sovereign versus what is not truly sovereignty. Because I think that like the truth, as I mentioned before, is like messier. It's like, you can have sovereignty, but sovereignty will still involve partnerships and relationships and some interdependency, hopefully not weaponized, as Nick brought up before.
Thank you for that, Pablo. Like a very quick follow-up question on that. What's the role of institutions here? Because institutions, just thinking about mine, right? It's a large public university. We procure licenses as well, right? Of course, there's, laws and procurement, guidelines that we follow, but it seems that at a more sort of on that sort of smaller scale, institutions are, participants in
Yeah,
this
for
sort of
sure.
sovereignty game, if you will.
For sure. And I'm sure that Nick and Shanasa are very well aware of the role of institutions in all of this. But, in the data that I assembled for the CNAS index that I talked about, you will be able to see kind of institutional participation in each of these projects. And generally speaking, higher education institutions, so universities, are involved. Nonprofits, the NGOs, are involved. In fact, for the handful of projects that exist, for example, in sub-Saharan Africa, I mean, those are, yes, government projects, but they are very much the output of universities and NGOs that are participating in these projects. And so I think that institutional capacity and institutional participation are critical to, at least to the world that I've been looking at.
Thank you for that. I think what's sort of in there a fair amount, and all of you brought it up either explicitly or implicitly, was the notion of trust, right? And so, Nick, you brought it to the table and you said that trust is actually where the rubber hits the road, if you will, especially in this agentic future that is ahead of us. You said that if there was such a thing in our near future as an international agentic economy, would have to very concretely think about trust vis-a-vis interoperability, inequality, and agentic dominance. And so you also said we need regulation and that maybe we should think about keeping the agentic scaffolding open. In some ways, these provocations and thoughts are not new. The internet was similarly disruptive. We have the open source movement and community, and there's certainly lessons to be learned. Can we take that as a model? Can we take the open source software movement and community as a model to think about what an economy of agents would look like? Because in some ways that is sort of antithetical to that, right? Because it's not about building a market.
Yeah, I mean, when I've been thinking about sort of what AI sovereignty might look like in this future, it echoes a lot of what Pablo said about a sort of solidarity-based idea of sovereignty. And I mean, the argument I've been making for this is no country, as Pablo rightly pointed out, can go it alone in terms of AI sovereignty. Even America is not, fully autarkic in that sense. You need to rely upon others. And the other sort of element of like working with others for your own domestic sovereignty is that if you have something like an open source repository of AI models, of harnesses, of scaffolding, of tools, of APIs, of all these different protocols that are necessary for these things to work, this is really useful, even if you don't go with it as a country. It's useful as a bargaining tool to say when you're negotiating with an American company, I do have a backup. My only backup isn't a Chinese company that I'm not going to go with. There's actually this well-respected repository of open source, elements. So I think, that then gives countries leverage in negotiating with American companies, with the American government. And I think that's quite important for sovereignty. And again, there's sort of this collective project of like everybody could contribute to it, everybody could benefit from it. And thinking of sovereignty again, not in this sort of pure, narrow, nationalistic way, but actually as a collective project of enabling domestic control, autonomy over technological use, over technological development, over all these sorts of key sovereignty issues. So yeah, I think open source has a massive role to play there. And I think agents have made it more viable than the chatbot era. So I'm quite, this is my one optimistic note in all of this is that it seems like an opening is emerging here. I was quite pessimistic a year ago, but yeah, Claude Code has changed it.
Right. And that field is just rapidly developing. I'm going to start folding on questions from the audience, and audience members, if want, please put more questions in. So Lily Chumley is asking you, Nick, about the agentic economy and framing it in terms of future access to something very powerful and very effective. Jury's sort of still out on that one, right? But definitely things are developing and changing. So Lily's asking about agent failures. Right now, high-end users using AI data can't trust their agents for very simple things. Like very, very quickly, we are in high-risk territory. How do we think about AI failures, especially vis-a-vis what you just spoke about in terms of the open source environment in which sort of it's up to you, the user or the operator, to sort of deal with failures because liability is, not constructed in the same way in which it would be just in a contractual a relationship between a company and a user or a license holder.
Yeah, I mean, I think the issue of failures is really prominent right now. Um, I mean, so I think one interesting case to look at is China's uh, sort of unexpected fascination with OpenClaw. It became a real cultural phenomenon over there. Raising your own lobster was the slogan of the past couple of months. But the Chinese government response was, that's great and I'll play with it. You're not using it in government systems. You're not using it in state-owned enterprises. You're not using it in anything where that failure might become a really significant issue. So I think there is, a lot of issues of failures at the moment, and I think that's to be expected. A lot of what researchers talking about agentic economies and researchers, the research I'm trying to do is to sort of gesture about like what happens if these improvements continue. And you have these sort of, benchmarks like meters, task time sort of measure, which is looking at how long can AI agents perform a task. And it's been doubling, I forget the exact figure, but like doubling every 4 months or so. And so it is increasing the capabilities of these models. The ability to avoid failure by these models and these systems is becoming much more capable. And my question in the agentic economy research sort of just goes from what if it does continue happening? If those improvements do continue, where do we go from there? And what do we need to sort of have in place now?
Mm. Thank you. Thank you, Nick, for that. Shinasa, I'm asking a question from Dennis. Can you maybe tell us a little bit about how we ought to judge success or capacity? It builds on what Nick said just now, right? Like, let's think about how we actually put a frame around what is good use, what's successful use, what's capacity, and what is a failure. What is sort of an African perspective on that, a very local African perspective, especially when it comes to users, not developers and companies, but everyday users?
Mhm. Yeah, definitely. So I think there are a couple of different aspects, but I would say, right now, the best value or use case for AI is particularly to help augment and expand government services, particularly when it comes to linguistic access, but just generally, with, improving how people interact with these services and also even receive things like social benefits from them. Or I would say on the consumer side, one, improved interactions again with government services would be a sign of success. Ideally, I would love to see actual tangible benefits of AI trickle down to consumers within African contexts. I think this is something that's very tricky because, again, we haven't seen that happen, even in, let's say, Western developed quote unquote economies. And so right now, the best ideal or, image of success really looks like improved general opportunity and also livelihoods, hopefully, for African consumers.
Thank you for that. And I think just, thinking back to that question I asked earlier about institutions, I do think like a more localized frames here could be quite meaningful. Um, I'm shifting gears a little bit, Pablo, and I'm going to ask about chips. And Lily has another question. What is the role of NVIDIA in sovereign AI projects? Are there any competitors? Are there non-American companies similarly invested in promoting, facilitating sovereignty projects? Um, what about countries who are caught between the US and China with relations to both, for example, Turkey or Pakistan? How can they imagine hybrid sovereignty?
Um, Let me kind of focus on the NVIDIA piece and broaden it a little bit. So NVIDIA has been very involved in kind of promoting sovereign AI. I think they've basically kind of like adopted it as a program. And if you kind of like look through NVIDIA's materials, they have really kind of promoted the idea of of countries, taking on their chips and broader infrastructure to develop their own AI systems. I think that this is, true also of a number of both American hyperscalers, European hyperscalers. You see. Uh, like a number of East Asian technology companies kind of promoting this as well, and also not super explicitly, but it's there. Chinese cloud companies too. So I think that like from the corporate side, there's a lot of kind of players in the space. And I think that really kind of like the question is like, is this, I mean, it's a little bit of a chicken and egg question, right? Like, is this something that's basically being promoted by corporations? Or is it something, that is really truly kind of like driven by, by countries as something that they need? Candidly, I think that it's a combination of both. And if you look at kind of like different projects, across regions, you can definitely see where, the government was very much kind of the driver of the effort and very much kind of, the impetus for it. And sometimes you definitely see kind of a corporate push. Truly, when you look across, these government the ones that the sovereignty projects that I looked at are ones that have government funding and really have like a deeper kind of government role. And even in those, you can see kind of where there maybe was a little bit more kind of corporate influence than a government driver. But as I mentioned, I mean, it's a spectrum and there's many flavors of how these work out. But it's a really interesting topic. And whoever asked the question, be worth it for them to kind of like look at that in terms of kind of like what's really driving the movement.
Thank you so much, Pablo. I think it's, quite obvious that we could talk for hours about this and we could have a very long conversation with our audience members about this as well, but we are at time. And so I want to sincerely thank Pablo, Nick, and Chinasa for joining me today for our conversation on geopolitics. I want to thank our very engaged audience members and my team who make all of this possible in DTD Lab here at UVA and IPK at NYU. Thank you so much for your support. Please do look up Pablo, Nick, and Chinasa. They do amazing work. They write a lot. You can read their work. Please go do that. Please also join us in the fall. This is our last event in the spring programming. We will reopen on September 23rd with a conversation on archives. We will also speak about quantum and we will talk about creativity in the fall. So please return. And with that, I'm wishing my panelists and all of you a wonderful and relaxing summer. Stay well and see you in the fall. Thank you.